German Chancellor Angela Merkel during the exploratory talks about forming a new coalition government. Credit REUTERSAxel. Schmidt. Angela Merkel's future was hanging in the balance last night after high-stakes talks to form a new government for Germany collapsed. Citing irreconcilable differences, the probusiness Free Democrats FDP pulled out of the talks, meaning Mrs Merkel will either seek to form a minority government with the Greens or a new election will be held. Today there was no progress, but rather there were setbacks because targeted compromises were questioned, FDP leader Christian Lindner told reporters. The four discussion partners have no common vision for modernization of the country or common basis of trust, Mr. Lindner said in the early hours of Monday morning, after dramatically walking out of coalition talks. It is better not to govern than to govern badly. In a somber press conference, held in the early hours of Monday morning, after talks collapsed, exhausted negotiators from the Greens, the CDU and the CSU, expressed their regret. We believe we were on a path where we could have reached an agreement. Mrs Merkel, who will contact German President Steinmeier on Monday morning to work out how to proceed, said. It's a day of deep reflection, she said, claiming she will do everything she can to move the country forward. Christian Lindner, head of the Free Democratic Party FDP, gives a statement to the media following troubled preliminary coalition talks. Credit Getty. Jurgen Trittin, Green Party politician, spoke of his party's shock and horror, saying that there were opportunities for agreement. It is clear the country will have to live with a managing government for a long time. For the first time, Mr. Trittin said, while Gerd Muller, CSU politician, expressed frustration over the timings of the walkout. We actually had the breakthrough now, he said. Disagreements around immigration have been a major part of the discussions after Germany's open-door policy to refugees in 2015, and the differences could prove irreconcilable. Mrs Merkel's conservative Christian Democrats CDU and sister Bavarian-only Christian Social Union CSU sat down for grueling talks with the probusiness Free Democrats FDP and the left-leaning Greens throughout the weekend in the hope of forming a new government, which is dubbed the Jamaica Coalition, because the party's colors match those of the Jamaican flag. Mrs Merkel had hoped to wrap up the exploratory talks, which began more than 4 weeks ago, by the end of the weekend, in order to avert fresh elections that could destabilize Germany and Europe. The four parties are already days past Mrs Merkel's initial Thursday deadline to establish the framework for the previously untested coalition. German election results. Potential ways to coalition government. Wolfgang Kubicki, FDP vice president, had set a 6 p.m. Sunday deadline for the talks to be completed, warning otherwise the whole thing is dead. But Katrin Göring-Eckardt, Green Party leader, said we negotiate as long as necessary. Horst Seehofer, CSU boss, added, I think we need a little bit more time. The delay is bad news for an increasingly vulnerable chancellor. Today is a day of destiny for Mrs Merkel, the Bild newspaper said Sunday before the deadline passed. If she fails to forge a coalition, then her chancellorship is in danger. After September's election, Mrs Merkel has been left without a majority, as voters angered by her liberal refugee policy turned to the fair-right alternative for Germany AfD. Her decision to let in more than 1 million asylum seekers since 2015 has become a stumbling block as she seeks an unlikely alliance between parties spanning the left and right of the political spectrum. A poll by Welt found that 61.4% of those surveyed believed a collapse of talks would mean an end to Mrs Merkel as chancellor. Only 31.5% thought otherwise. Failure to reach a deal could lead to new elections, something all the parties are anxious to avoid as they fear this could lead to the far-right AfD making further gains after surging into parliament in September, to become the third largest party. Katrin Göring-Eckardt, right, and the Greens co-chairman, Cem Özdemir. Credit K. Needfeld. So far the center-left Social Democratic Party SDP has adamantly ruled out returning to a grand coalition with Mrs Merkel, after suffering a humiliating loss in September's elections. If Jamaica negotiations fail, Mrs Merkel may have no choice but to form a minority government, or battle it out in a snap election in 2 months' time. The delay has highlighted the deep divisions between the parties. The biggest issue of contention in the Jamaica discussions is family reunification for refugees, according to those close to the talks. The Greens are demanding that those given temporary asylum because they are fleeing wars should be allowed to bring their relatives to join them in Germany, which other parties oppose. The parties have also clashed over CSU demands for an upper limit of 200,000 on the number of asylum seekers allowed into Germany each year, and Green calls to close coal-fired power stations. However, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, Germany's president, has played down the conflict, telling the Welt am Sonntag newspaper that if negotiators are battling hard over major questions like migration and climate change, that may not be a bad thing for democracy. There is no need to start holding panic debates about new elections, he said.